Paul Bloom is our next speaker. Paul, come and tell us how pleasure works.
Thank you. Thank you. I'm going to talk today about the pleasures of everyday life, but I want to begin with an unusual story about an unusual man. This is Hermann Goering. He was Hitler's designated successor. And during World War II, he fancied himself as an art collector. And he went through Europe stealing, extorting, and buying various paintings, which he kept in a large collection. What he really wanted was a painting by Vermeer. Hitler had two, and he didn't have any. And he was engaged in a friendly competition with his boss. And finally, after a lot of looking, he made contact with this man, a Dutch art dealer named Hun van Meegeren. And for what would now be $10 million, he purchased a beautiful Vermeer from Van Meegeren. The war ended. Goering was captured, was sent to Nuremberg, charged with crimes against humanity, and ultimately sentenced to death. But the Allied forces also went through his collection, and they found his paintings, and they found where they came from, and eventually they went after Van Meegeren. He was arrested in Holland, put in prison, charged with treason, charged with the crime of selling this great Dutch masterpiece to a Nazi. After 6 weeks in prison, Van Meegeren couldn't take it anymore, and he confessed, but not to treason. He said, "I did not sell a wonderful Vermeer to that disgusting Nazi. I sold him a forgery. I painted it myself." Nobody believed him. So he said, "Fine, bring me paint and canvas, and I will show you that I can do this again." They brought him paint and canvas. He also demanded alcohol and morphine, which is the only way he could work. And then he produced a dazzling Vermeer, far better than what he sold Goering. Now, there's a lot more to be said about this forger. He was a fascinating man. But I want to turn back to Goering. This is a picture of him conversing with his lawyer at Nuremberg. Goering was, in many ways, a terrible man. Even for a Nazi, he was a terrible man. His American interrogators described him as an amicable psychopath. But you could feel for him his shock when he was told by an American official that his most prized painting was actually a forgery. According to his biographer, this I find very touching. He looked as if for the first time he had discovered there was evil in the world. He killed himself soon afterwards. Now, he had discovered something profound, something really important. You see, he had thought he had owned this painting, but it turned out he had owned that painting. Entirely different. It wasn't just him. Once Van Meegeren was on trial, he couldn't stop talking, and he boasted about all of the great Dutch paintings, presumably painted by masters that were actually his work. So the Dutch people were stunned to learn that the Supper at Emmaus, once the most valuable painting in Holland, people would travel through Europe to see it, was actually not this painting, but that painting, a forgery. It was immediately removed from the museum, and according to Dutch law, could have been destroyed on the spot. Now, I'm a psychologist. I'm interested in how we evaluate and the pleasure we get from things. And to me, that poses a huge puzzle. Why does it matter so much who did the painting? Why does the origin of the art matter too much? And it turns out there's a fairly common answer. Social critics like Veblen and Tom Wolfe have argued that a lot of what goes on when we acquire paintings and other such valuable objects is displays of status. We don't get them because of the aesthetic experience that they provide, rather to show off. Originals are always going to be more scarce than forgeries. And so it shows off. If you own an original, it shows the world how much money you have, how much discernment, your connections. It's sort of flim-flam. Now, I don't doubt for a moment that this is part of the reason why we collect and enjoy art. But what I want to suggest to you is that it's not the entire reason. I want to suggest to you in this brief talk to take seriously another alternative, which is what philosophers and psychologists call essentialism. And that means that when we respond to something, Intellectually, aesthetically, emotionally, we respond not just to its physical makeup, what it looks like, what we can see, but to what we believe to be its deeper essence. And this is particularly the case for pleasure. Pleasure is deep. And to make this case, I want to show you that this applies not just to art, but even to seemingly simple pleasures. I will argue that these are not so simple after all. So take as my first example, food. Would you eat this? Well, the typical answer one would get is, it depends, what is it? Some of you would eat it if it's beef but not pork, some if it's pork but not beef. Most of you wouldn't eat it if it was dog or rat or human. Some of you would only eat it if it's a strangely colored piece of tofu. That's not so surprising. But what's more interesting is how it will taste to you depends critically on what you think it is. And there's all sorts of laboratory demonstrations of this. One demonstration was with children. How do you get children to think that carrots and milk taste really good? Not just get them more likely to eat the carrots and drink the milk, but to get them to rank the flavor as much higher. It is incredibly simple. You remove them from a McDonald's bag. Their belief that these are McDonald's products ups the taste, their perception of taste. How do you get an adult to think wine tastes really, really good? Answer is, you pour it from an expensive bottle. This has been done dozens, probably hundreds of times now in a laboratory. If people think they're drinking, I don't know much about wine, but if they're drinking a Grand Cru, which I assume is good, it tastes much better than if they're drinking a Van Ordinaire, which I assume is not so good. This study has been replicated with a neuroscience twist. People have been put into scanners. They lie down. They sip wine while their brains are being scanned. In front of them on a screen is information about the wine. If they think they're drinking the cheap stuff, they say, and they don't respond very much. But if they think they're drinking a $100 glass, the pleasure centers of the brain light up like a Christmas tree. Sex. These are, by studies I have done with my colleagues at Yale, two attractive individuals. But how attractive you find them depends critically on who and what you think they are. You probably think the person on the left is male, the person on the right is female. If that belief turns out to be wrong, it will make a difference. It will make a difference to you if they are much younger or much older than you think they are. It would make a difference to you if you discovered that you were looking with lust at somebody who was a disguised version of your brother or sister, your mother or father, your son or daughter. You might still find them attractive, but it would tend to kill the sexual desire. It will make a profound difference to you how much you like them. One of the great findings in psychology is the more you like somebody, the better off they look, the better they look to you physically. This is why couples in happy marriages each of them tends to think their husband or wife looks a lot better than anyone else thinks they look. Your belief about somebody affects how you respond to them. And I'd like to illustrate this with a somewhat dramatic example. This was from a study of a woman of Capgras syndrome. Capgras syndrome is a rare neurological disorder where you develop a delusion that the people you love most in the world have been replaced by exact duplicates. Now, often the consequences of Capgras syndrome are terrible. People have murdered their husbands and wives, believing them to be imposters. But there was at least one case where Capgras syndrome turned out very well. In 1931, research described a woman with Capgras syndrome who complained about her poorly endowed and sexually inadequate lover. Then she got Capgras syndrome. She was happy to report that she had discovered he possessed a double who was rich, virile, handsome, and aristocratic. As a third case, consider consumer products. One reason why we might like an object is because of its utility, what it can do for us. You can wear shoes, you can play golf with golf clubs, and you can't do anything with chewed up bubblegum. But each of these objects has value above and beyond its material properties. The golf clubs were owned by John F. Kennedy and sold at auction for $750,000. The bubblegum was chewed by Britney Spears and sold for several $100s at auction. And in fact, there's a history of people paying a lot of money for the partially eaten food of people that they admire. The shoes may be worth most of all. According to a New York Times report, a Saudi millionaire offered $10 million for those pair of shoes. Some of you may recognize them. They were the shoes thrown at President George Bush at a press conference about a year ago. Now, these are all celebrity objects, but the same moral applies to the objects that we own, our everyday objects, like our wedding rings and our children's baby shoes. We collect them, some of us collect them, and value them not because of their material properties, but because of their history. They are literally irreplaceable, because why you like them isn't the sort of thing that can be replaced. It's attached to specific history. My colleagues and I at Yale have explored certain factors in why we like certain objects. And one of the studies we did started by asking people to name somebody who they really admired. And one typical answer was George Clooney. Then we asked them to, how much would you pay for a sweater that was owned by George Clooney? The answer is a fair amount, $135. Then we offered different conditions. So we said, look, what if you couldn't tell anybody about the sweater and you couldn't resell it? We want to see how much is this extra money is because you could boast about it. And a little bit of it is. It drops a bit. But what really causes a drop is we tell another group of subjects, before it got to you, you could tell anybody you own it, you could resell it, but before it got to you, it was thoroughly washed. This causes a substantial drop in how it's valued. As my wife put it, you've washed away the Clooney cooties. Well, let's bring this back to art. I would love a Chagall. I assume there are some people of means in the audience. If you all want to get together and get me something, a Chagall would be a superb choice. But I do not want a copy of a Chagall, even if I couldn't tell the difference. This isn't because I'm a snob and want to boast about it, not entirely. It's because I want something that was painted by Marc Chagall, that had that sort of history. Here, what matters isn't so much the physical contact, but rather the history of the artwork as it reflects the genius of its creator. And this is a point made very nicely by the philosopher Dennis Dutton, who sadly passed away just a few months ago. Dutton, in The Art Instinct, writes, "The value of an artwork is rooted in assumptions about the human performance underlying its creation." This is the difference between an original and a duplicate. An original, they might look the same, but an original has a history that is the end work of a creative process. The duplicate or forgery does not. This can explain differences in people's tastes. How many people here really enjoy the work of Jackson Pollock? How many people here it does nothing for you? Okay. I have nothing to say about who's right, and I have my own opinion. But here's my prediction. My prediction is the people who like the work of Jackson Pollock have a different perception of how it was created. If you think it is arduous, physically difficult work taking many hours and days and weeks, requiring considerable virtuosity and creativity, you're more likely to like it than if you think it's some guy splashing paint onto a canvas. And there's certain demonstrations that suggest that this is true. The reason why I chose Jackson Pollock as an example is that there's a young artist who paints very much in the style of Jackson Pollock, and her work received thousands of dollars per painting. Now, this had to do with the fact she was a very young artist. This is Marla Olmsted, who did most of her work when she was 3 or 4. But the twist is, 60 Minutes 2 did a special on her and concluded that she wasn't doing it by herself. Her father was coaching her. When this came out, the value of the artwork dropped to nothing. Now, part of you might say, well, who cares? What difference does it make? If you liked it then, why don't you like it now? But when you like something, you are driven, at least in part, based on your beliefs about how it came into being. I'll illustrate this with 2 final examples, both about music. This is Joshua Bell, a great violinist. And in an audacious experiment, the Washington Post reporter, Gene Weingarten, wanted to know how much would people like Joshua Bell if they didn't know they were listening to Joshua Bell. So we got him to perform, to take his $1 million Stradivarius and perform in a Washington, D.C. subway station. And the question is, how much money would he get? And here's a brief clip of his performance. He's over there. After being there for about 3/4 of an hour, he made about $32, which is not bad, but it's also not very good. He actually made $20 more, but they didn't count it. Towards the end of the video, and you can see the video online, a woman stops and stares at him. Because it turns out a few weeks ago, she had seen him perform at the Library of Congress to thousands. And so she stares for a while, then she goes into her purse, and struck with sympathy at this tremendous reversal of fortune, hands him $20. My second example from art is, and my favorite, is some of you may be familiar with the modernist performance by John Cage, 4 minutes and 33 seconds, where a pianist sits down at a piano, opens it up, and sits perfectly still doing nothing for 4 minutes and 33 seconds. And people have different reactions to this, but it's an audacious and interesting performance. But I want to point out that you can buy this from iTunes. I think providing a dramatic illustration of how what you believe about something, even silence, can affect the pleasure you get from it. Now, I've talked all about pleasure. I just want to end on a note suggesting that everything I said would apply as well to pain. Your experience of pain can be transformed by what you think about it, by what you know about it. Kurt Gray and Dan Wegner at Harvard University do a lovely study where they get undergraduates to hook themselves up and receive electric shocks. It turns out that if they believe the electric shocks were caused by a benevolent person in the other room who has no evil intentions towards them, it hurts, and then the pain gradually goes away. But when they believe they're getting the shocks from somebody who doesn't like them, who's shocking them on purpose, it hurts more, and the pain doesn't go away. Pain is more painful when you think that it is caused by somebody who doesn't like you. I think we can even take pain and, under the right circumstances, transform it to pleasure, what Paul Rozin has described as benign masochism. Under certain controlled circumstances, what's normally painful could be pleasurable, like the experience of hot chilies or roller coaster rides. All of this leads me to conclude with a quotation from William Shakespeare, which is, "There's nothing either good or bad, but thinking makes it so." Thank you.
Bravo, Paul. That's good.